She lay in the snow, barely breathing. Her paws were torn, her fur coated in frost, and her eyes were empty. No one stopped. No one helped. She had accepted that this was the end. But in that moment, a soldier who had seen too much death couldn't walk away. He didn't know her name. Didn't know if she would make it. But what happened next changed not just her life, but his own. Let's start from the beginning. Sergeant Daniel Harris had seen a lot in his 10 years of service. He knew what despair sounded like. He'd heard it in the voices of comrades dying in his arms, seen it in the eyes of children who had lost their parents, felt it in his own heart when his battle-worn body could take no more. But now, the war was behind him. The snow-covered landscapes of Montana felt foreign and peaceful. No screams, no gunfire, no explosions. Just snow settling like a white blanket along the roadside, the wind whispering through the trees, and silence. He was driving home after a long day. His Jeep rocked gently over the uneven road, headlights cutting through the darkness. The radio crackled, old country tunes playing softly against the hum of the engine. And then he saw her. Against the blinding white snow, something dark lay near the edge of the road. A small shape, almost unnoticeable. But it was moving. Barely. Just a little. Daniel slammed on the brakes. The Jeep skidded slightly on the frozen ground, but he didn't care. He already knew what he had seen. The door flew open, and the freezing air burned his face. He stepped forward, snow crunching under his boots. His chest tightened. A dog lay before him, a German shepherd. She was barely moving. Her dark fur was matted, covered in frost. Her legs had given out, as if she no longer had the strength to stand. Her chest rose and fell slowly, each breath a struggle. She was on the edge, too long in the snow, too long alone. Daniel crouched beside her. "Hey, girl." His voice was rough from the cold and held back emotions. No response. He reached out but froze as he saw the way she trembled. Not from the cold, from fear. When his fingers brushed against her side, she barely flinched. She wanted to move away, but couldn't. She was afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of people. But most of all, she was afraid of hope. He had seen that look before. Soldiers who had nothing left to hold on to. People who had accepted death because there was no reason left to fight. And now he saw it in her eyes. She had already given up. A deep anger stirred inside him. Who the hell did this? Who left her here like this? Who made her so scared that even at death's door she didn't believe she could be saved? No. He wouldn't let that happen. Daniel tore off his warm military jacket and gently placed it over her. She didn't resist. She just trembled, too weak to lift her head. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms. God, she was so light. Too light. He could feel her bones, the way her frost-bitten legs dangled helplessly. She shouldn't have survived this long, but she had. And that meant he wasn't leaving her here. Daniel held her close, trying to warm her frozen body, and moved quickly back to the Jeep. Every step was a race against time. She was dying in his arms, but he wouldn't let her go. Daniel felt the dog trembling in his arms as he carefully wrapped her in his jacket. Her body was fragile, nothing more than skin and bones. She didn't resist. She was barely breathing. The cold seeped through his clothes, but he didn't let her go. She was too light, too still. Time had become his enemy. He stepped toward the Jeep, holding her tighter, as if that alone could keep her here, in this world. As he set her down on the passenger seat, a faint whimper escaped her. "Hold on, girl. Just hold on," he rasped, slamming the door and stepping hard on the gas. 40 minutes. 40 minutes where every second stretched into eternity. The engine groaned, tires skidding on the snow-covered road. But Daniel didn't slow down. Inside the Jeep, silence. He glanced at her quickly, She wasn't moving. Her breathing was ragged, eyes closed. No. His jaw clenched, fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter. Memories flashed through his mind. Iraq. Sergeant Gilmore bleeding out in his arms. Hold on, brother, just hold on. The medics didn't make it in time. Afghanistan. Private Lee, barely more than a kid. A gunshot wound to the shoulder, fear in his eyes. I don't want to die, Sergeant. Daniel had held his hand until it went limp. No. He wasn't losing her. Not again. Just a little longer, girl. His voice shook with tension. You're with me. You're gonna make it. The clinic. Daniel burst into the emergency room, shoulder slamming the door open. Help! Heads turned. What happened? She's dying. 2 nurses rushed over. Quick, get her to the operating room. An hour of waiting. He sat in the hallway, fists clenched. Muffled voices came from the exam room. Medical equipment beeping. Then silence. The door creaked open. A doctor stood in the doorway. A man in his 50s, gray at the temples, eyes weary. How is she? Daniel's voice was barely more than a whisper. The doctor exhaled. You got her here just in time, but she's in critical condition. Does she have a chance? The vet rubbed a hand over his face. She's very weak. Severe malnutrition. Frostbite on her paws. We had to administer warm fluids to stabilize her body temperature. He hesitated. Honestly, I don't know if she'll make it. Daniel looked away. He knew what it meant to lose those you tried to save. He knew what it meant to be too late. But this time, he refused to accept it. I'm staying here. The doctor studied him, saw something in his eyes, the kind of resolve that wouldn't take no for an answer, and nodded. All right, but be prepared for the worst. Daniel didn't respond. He just walked into the room and sat beside her stretcher. She was still breathing, and that meant it wasn't over yet. Grace, as Daniel had named her, fought for her life for 3 days. Every morning he came to the clinic, sat beside her stretcher, waited. She never opened her eyes. Her body remained still, her breathing slow and weak. The doctors said she might never wake up, but he couldn't believe that. Every time he sat with her, he spoke softly. You're strong, girl. I've seen fighters give up faster than you, but you won't give up, you hear me? He didn't know if she could hear him, but on the 3rd day, something changed. A barely noticeable twitch of her paw, a quiet, shaky breath. Then her eyelids fluttered. Daniel held his breath. Slowly, her eyes opened. Their gazes met. Grace was alive. Daniel smiled. You made it. She watched him cautiously. But now, there was no emptiness in her eyes. Once she stabilized, Daniel knew he had to find out what had happened to her. He walked up to the reception desk and spotted a familiar face. Dr. Bennett, the same vet who had fought to save Grace. Doc, did you find anything? Bennett took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and sighed. I reached out to local shelters and animal control. We found some information. And Bennett met his gaze. She was chained up. A cold weight settled in Daniel's stomach. What? Judging by the old scars and the marks around her neck, she was kept tied up for a long time. And not just that, she was beaten. Regularly. Who did this? The police arrested a man in the next county for animal cruelty. He was breeding dogs for illegal fights. When authorities closed in on him, he got rid of the ones he didn't need anymore. Bennett held Daniel's stare. He dumped her in the woods, tied to a tree, and just walked away. The world around him faded into silence. Something inside Daniel snapped. Rage burned sharp and deep in his chest. War had taught him a lot. He had seen evil, seen betrayal, seen people commit unspeakable acts. But this, leaving a living creature to die in the snow just because it was no longer useful, this wasn't war. This was a betrayal of humanity itself. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Bennett saw the look in his eyes. "Daniel, I understand how you feel, but that bastard has already been charged. Not enough. He'll face justice." Daniel stayed silent. Anger clouded his thoughts. He glanced at the door to Grace's room. He had seen her scars, her fear, her distrust of people. But she was alive, and he knew there was something more important he could do for her than vengeance. He made his decision. "I'm taking her home." Bennett blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" "She didn't just survive, she deserves to live." And he would do everything to make sure that happened. A few weeks later, winter was slowly retreating, and rays of sunlight began piercing through Montana's gray sky. Daniel's home had become a new world for Grace, a world without screams, pain, or cold. But fear didn't fade so easily. She still didn't trust the world. She only ate when Daniel left the room. She never came too close, always watching from a distance, leaving herself an escape route. She never slept openly, her body always tense, ready to run at the first sign of danger. But Daniel didn't rush her. He knew what it was like to live in fear. So he simply stayed. Every morning, he set a bowl of food by the door, sat nearby with his coffee, and waited. Sometimes, he read aloud, not expecting an answer. "You know, Grace, when I was in Afghanistan, we had a dog. Small, a stray, but smart. Her name was Lexi. She always knew when we were coming back from a mission. She'd just sit outside the tent and wait. No one tamed her, but she chose us." Grace watched him, but didn't come closer. At night, he left the living room door open. Sometimes, when he fell asleep on the couch with the TV humming in the background, he thought he heard quiet, careful footsteps. But every time he opened his eyes, Grace was still in her corner, always at a distance. The first step toward trust. One night, as the wind howled outside, Daniel woke to a soft touch. At first, he didn't understand what had roused him. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw her, Grace, standing by his bed, silent, cautious. But she had taken a step, and then another. Daniel didn't move. He didn't want to scare her away. Slowly, she lowered herself beside his hand, then gently rested her head on his palm. In that moment, everything changed. Holding his breath, Daniel ran his fingers softly over her head. She didn't flinch. Her breathing was steady. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Freedom. The next morning, Grace didn't retreat to her corner when he got up. She stayed close. She watched as he brewed his coffee. When he stepped outside, she followed him to the porch and sat beside him. She no longer flinched at every sound. She no longer recoiled from sudden movements. She was learning to trust. A defining moment. That day, Daniel was about to head out for his morning run. He pulled on his jacket, tied his laces, and opened the door. Before he could step outside, Grace stood beside him. It wasn't just movement. She looked at him with certainty, not fear, not hesitation. She had made a choice. She was ready. Daniel looked at her, warmth spreading in his chest. He smiled. "Well, girl?" His voice was soft, but filled with pride. "Ready for a new life?" She wagged her tail. Quiet, but sure. He pushed the door open. Crisp morning air rushed in. Grace took a step forward, then another, and suddenly she ran. Not fleeing, not escaping, but finally, truly free. A found family. As he ran alongside her on the snowy road, hearing her steady breath, Watching her body move with effortless ease, he realized she hadn't just survived. She had found a home. She had found family, just like he had.